you said fresh from the University of Manitoba. I don't know how fresh I am at the end of the day on a Friday, but it's great to see so many of you here, so thank you. As David mentioned, this is a paper that I'm working on with my friend and collaborator, Conor Moore, who is a staff organizer at IATSE. So he's not here today. He's busy organizing staff on a Hallmark movie set. So sounds fun. Anyhow, so this project is something we've been working on now for, well, going on 2 years, I guess. Trying to map union collective bargaining agreement gains during the pandemic. So during the sort of lockdown phase of the pandemic, from the dates we have set of March 2020 to basically the end of 2022. And I'll explain a little bit more about how we've been doing that, but we were kind of motivated to do that by just feeling a little bit depressed. I know Rebecca was talking about, all these like, exciting things, and we sort of kind of felt the other way, that it was kind of a missed opportunity, we thought. And so we actually wanted to start to go through some of the collective agreements that were negotiated during that period to see what unions were actually doing sort of beyond the typical things like wages and so on. If they were able to use the opening provided by the pandemic to address things specific to the pandemic. So that's kind of what we were looking at. So this is preliminary results from the sample of collective agreements that we've gone through so far. So just a little kind of outline of what I'll do. First, I want to talk a little bit about the context of labor and unions during the pandemic. Try not to be too depressing. And then I'll talk about the project, our sample of collective agreements, which focuses just on Ontario, BC, Quebec, and the federal jurisdiction. The reason for that is because all the other provinces have horrendous record-keeping practices, and those things are not available publicly. So these are the 4 jurisdictions where you can actually get access to collective agreements to build this kind of a database. So then I'll highlight some of our findings by industry and by provision area. So in particular, I'll look at healthcare and social assistance as one industry, and then cleaning services as another. And then I'll go through some of the language around recall and seniority, pandemic pay and leave, which are sort of some prominent areas that we've identified. So to start, we situate our study in relation to other work that's already been written on labor in the pandemic in Canada. So a lot of this work is focused, of course, on the disproportionate impacts that racialized and women workers experience, job loss, those types of things. Some scholars have also sort of highlighted the lack of kind of class-wide demands on the part of unions. As I said, kind of a missed opportunity in some senses. Some things are notable, for example, winning paid sick days in the federal jurisdiction and in British Columbia. But beyond that, there was a missed opportunity. We had this temporary expansion of the welfare state in Canada. You had the CERB, you had expanded unemployment benefits. Most of those things have retreated right back to the norm. We've kind of gone entirely back to normal on most things. I mean, even if you look at something like EI reform, we're basically back to the old rules of EI, even though we've known it's been broken for decades. So there was this real missed opportunity. Density, union density, our sort of standard measure of the strength of labor, it is completely unchanged. We're essentially still at 30%. It shot up when people were losing their jobs because it was mostly non-union people losing their jobs, and then it went right back to 30%. Strikes, I mean, they increased, I would say, slightly after the pandemic. Of course, there's some very exciting strikes that took place, but on the whole, I mean, if you take a longer historical look, it was a very marginal, small strike wave, and it's kind of already dissipating. So, I mean, maybe that's too depressing for some people, but that's how I would read it. I should say also that, during the pandemic, a lot of unions delayed bargaining or signed sort of extensions, one-year extensions. So that affects our sample a little bit, but we've, of course, any union that signed an extension, we've included them in the sample, so that kind of evens it out a little bit. And last, I just sort of mentioned union wage settlements. So in the decade sort of prior to the pandemic, union wage settlements were essentially tracking below inflation. When inflation's running at 2% and you're negotiating agreements that average, 1.8, maybe that's tolerable because it's not that noticeable. But when inflation shoots to 6.8 or 8%, it averaged 6.8 in 2022, and unions were just nowhere near equipped to match that. So this idea that we were going to have a wage price spiral, of course, nothing materialized because labor just did not have the structural power it did in the 70s or 80s to produce that kind of an effect. So even in the provinces where governments were interfering in bargaining through legislation like Ontario, Manitoba, Alberta to an extent, when they imposed those laws like Bill 124 or 128, I can't remember the number, in Ontario, um, in the decade prior to that, public sector agreements averaged, I think, 1.4%, and they were capping them at 1. So kind of a stupid political overreach. They were already accomplishing it before they even had the law in place. So this kind of, the pandemic didn't, I mean, unions had a lot to sort of get overcome to essentially break that cycle, and they really weren't able to do it. I mean, average settlements went up to 3.5% at their height, but I mean, they didn't get anywhere near inflation. So given that overall context, Connor and I were interested in looking at other areas of contract negotiation, specifically things that we thought were pertinent to the pandemic. So what we did was collect collective agreements that were ratified, as I said, between the beginning of the pandemic, which we just put it at March 1st, to the end of December 2022. So we have a sample of, right now, 221 agreements, 94 from Quebec, 85 from Ontario, 28 from BC, and 14 from the federal jurisdiction. And I'll just mention, too, that we have a fantastic research assistant at the University of Manitoba who is bilingual, because neither one of us are bilingual. So without her assistance, those 94 wouldn't be there. So I just want to point that out. Madeline Gustafson, she's fantastic. And then so we gathered these through NegotiaTech and the ministries of labor of the provinces. And we essentially keyword searched them for anything related to the pandemic, to COVID, because we were looking just specifically for provisions related to the pandemic. And then we sort of worked inductively to code them along sort of contract provision areas, essentially to group them. So these are the themes. I won't go through them all, but some of the prominent ones: recall and seniority, pay and bonuses, paid leave, unpaid leave, remote work, which just shouldn't surprise anyone. Things that were related to the COVID like response, like ad hoc provisional committees, things related to health and safety, that kind of stuff, scheduling, hours of work, and so on. This is the exhaustive list, and we kind of had to work, as I said, inductively to create that list, to start grouping things. And we also coded, of course, all the collective agreements by their date, by the union, by the employer, by the sector and the industry, so public-private sector, industry along the NAICS code, and then, of course, language related to the pandemic. So most, but not all, of the provisions are in side agreements, letters of understanding, memorandums of understanding, those kinds of things, but not all of them. Unions, there are a number of unions, actually, that use the pandemic strategically to get permanent contract language changes in these areas, and I'll highlight a few of them that we think are important to note. Just a couple things about the limitation of the sample before I move into it. So, as I said, record keeping for collective agreements is terrible in Canada. These 4 jurisdictions do somewhat of an okay job, but the rest, we can't do this without, I mean, you essentially have to do kind of like archival work to do that. So we can't make any claim about the sample being exhaustive or representative, just interesting. So we're not able to say what percentage of collective bargaining agreements, for example, negotiated during that time frame had pandemic-related provisions in them. We just have the sample of 221. Yes, and I guess the last thing that I'll say is that we tried to stay away from the vaccine issue as much as we could, because how contentious that was. And of course, unions had this, duty to fair representation. They had to, anyways. I worked at the Canadian Labour Congress at the time, and we were getting requests to like track this stuff and the number of job losses related to vaccines and all this sort of stuff. And unions, of course, were doing their due diligence. They had to, but it was contentious. So we try to stay away from that as much as we can. Okay, so yes, this is a sort of broad overview of the provision areas, as I said. So the largest provision area relates to recall and seniority, which is actually kind of surprising to us. We were assuming that we would get a lot of things like the other ones that you see, pandemic pay, remote work, right? Because this was such a sort of issue in the discourse. But the largest area actually is recall and seniority. And as I'll explain in a while, in a little bit, a couple slides, this is concentrated in the private sector, actually. And it's very interesting where it's concentrated because it's among lower wage workers with much less job security. And so you'll see we see a real distinction between what public sector unions were doing and what private sector unions were doing. And private sector unions were doing much more of this because their workers just tend to have fewer of these protections already embedded in their agreements. Or, yeah, I mean, the ability, if you're laid off, you can come back. Yeah, essentially it's job security protection. Yeah. And then the next largest area, scheduling and hours of work. There's a kind of mishmash of things in there. I'm not going to talk too much of that. Pandemic pay and bonuses, so things related specifically to the pandemic, remote work, paid leave, and then some of these other areas that I mentioned before. So as I said, most of these are in side agreements, but not all. And I think importantly, there's some strategic gains that we'll highlight. And last, just to note that obviously agreements often have more than one pandemic clause in them or one pandemic provision. So there's more provisions than there are CBAs, but I'm going to talk about sort of shares of provisions, just kind of keep it simple. Okay, so this is just unions in the sample. I won't spend too much time on this. It's kind of not surprising. CUPE is the largest, followed by CSN here in Quebec, UFCW, Unifor, Steelworkers. So the only thing really that's sort of surprising to highlight about this is the presence of a couple of unions that represent lower wage private sector workers like LIUNA and SEIU. LIUNA, those contracts are largely for cleaning services actually. And so we found some really interesting things there. And then there are more unions that are represented in the chart here, but they just had fewer agreements, so we didn't include them, of course. And Conor's upset that IATSE is not in there more, but part of this is that sometimes some of these unions negotiate big contracts that cover multiple workplaces. Like that's the case with IATSE, right? When they have like a master agreement that covers the whole lower mainland of Vancouver, for example, or BC. So, yes. So by industry, so we do this by NAICS. Unsurprising here, public administration accounts for the largest number of CBAs with COVID-related language, followed by healthcare and social assistance, manufacturing, accommodation, food service, and admin and waste services, which again are some of these cleaning contracts that are really, really interesting. So public sector unions they dominate the sample, but again, the things that they're focused on are very different than public sector, private sector unions, and I'll get into some of that when I look at the provision areas a little bit more closely. So just to focus in on the industry a little bit, healthcare and social assistance. So in this case, the largest area is pay and bonuses. So under pay and bonuses here, we have top-ups and extensions to government pandemic bonuses. This is a really common thing for unions to do. If governments had something in place that was already, a provincial government had something in place, like a top-up wage for healthcare workers, for workers in grocery, for example, unions would try to get that into the agreement. Sometimes on a temporary basis, but not always. In some cases, they were able to get things into contracts to make that permanent. So you have features where, for example, a union is able to get something that says if there's a health emergency or any kind of state of emergency declared by a province or by a government, the bonus automatically kicks back in. So making it permanent that way. COVID committees. This was interesting too, because there's been some stuff written, Eric Tucker, for example, on the failure of health and safety committees to adequately address or to sort of function really during the pandemic to provide that additional layer of protection. So unions negotiated a number of these sort of ad hoc COVID response committees with regular meetings to deal with workplace issues as they arose, which were interesting, and this is much more common in the public sector. And then last, there's this, in this sector anyways, it's very common to find protections or sort of marginal protections in some case, over excessive workload, so overtime and special overtime rates. Common also to see paid sick leave provisions, and I'll show some examples of that later on. But some of the working time and scheduling stuff you see here and in public administration pretty prominently. Okay, so this, I said I wanted to talk about recall and seniority. So this, remember, is the most common provision across collective bargaining agreements, so representing 21% of the overall provisions in the sample. But it's highly concentrated in two industries. That administrative waste services, that industry has a very long name, covers a lot of things, and accommodation and food services. So again, two industries with a large number of low-wage workers. And this is pretty remarkable, really, because these two industries account for nearly 2/3, so almost 66% of those recall and seniority provisions, 53% in accommodation, food service, sorry, and what was it? And then 29% in transport and warehousing. So, clearly a focus for unions, strong focus. And again, these are private sector union members with much lower levels of job security than public sector workers generally. Okay. Yeah, so it seems it was, a key priority area for these unions, and something that we didn't expect, I guess, because of the types of unions that we had in mind when we started the sample. But as we built it over time, this emerged as a really prominent area. And in the paper, we spend quite a bit of time discussing this. And I think one of the things that interested people sort of in the kind of, when there was this growing interest in unions during the pandemic, I think it makes a certain amount of sense. A lot of it was around job security protection. As people who were non-union were losing their jobs, interest in unionization, I think, had a lot to do with that sort of protection. So just talk about remote work here for a moment. Just to kind of highlight some of the language. So it's most common to find remote work provisions in the public administration sector, a lot of this in municipal government services, but also spread over other industries as well. And we just included some sample language here. So a lot of this kind of similar to what we're seeing in the federal public service, what PSAC ultimately got in their contract, a kind of agreement to talk about it later. A lot of that, striking of committees to talk about remote work down the road. There's a lot of language related to that. Or a kind of commitment that you can come to us and talk about it on an individual basis, right? But not a sort of right to remote work embedded in the contract. So I know that was the big story out of PSAC, but in the sample, we already find sort of examples of that preceded it, that this is kind of where employers were at. There is some stronger language, though. I won't go through the whole thing for time purposes, but IATSE, this is the Animation Guild in BC, they negotiated a provision in their remote contract to sort of essentially force the employer to cover costs of setting up work from home, which is some of the stronger language that we found. But again, this is it's uncommon. It's just exemplary for the strength. And it's more common to see like, yeah, we'll talk about it later, that sort of thing. Pay and bonuses. So I won't spend too much time here. As I mentioned, the top-ups were very common. Especially in healthcare and social assistance, but also present in other agreements. So I have one here from, it's hospital, but it's a food service provider, kind of an example, right, of embedding this emergency top-up as a permanent feature. And then the same thing in the bottom, a Unifor local, this is at a nursing home. Similar thing here, just sort of setting out the formula for providing pandemic pay. On paid leave, most of these were temporary, but again, not all. Efforts made to kind of embed them when there is an emergency. This was a common tactic that we found. So some example language here. This first one at a daycare center, and the next, which is a stronger one actually at Indigo Books, which was one of the sort of success stories actually during the pandemic of unionizing retail workers. UFCW unionized, I think, 4 Indigo stores in the Greater Toronto area at the time, and this is language from one of those agreement, just providing pay for a maximum 14-day period when you go off on sick leave related to COVID. So a pretty strong provision when you consider sort of what was available statutorily at the time. Okay, so I'll just conclude here. So as I said, many unions faced real wage losses during and after the pandemic, but as we argue in the paper, those that did bargain during the pandemic made some important gains in other areas, and that's sort of what we're trying to highlight, really what the um, the sort of advantage of unionization at a kind of basic level by looking at what unions were actually doing during the pandemic. So as I said, many unions prioritized protections that were related to layoffs, recall, and seniority, which is I guess maybe it shouldn't be a surprising finding, but it was a bit of a surprising finding for us because it wasn't what we expected to be most prominent. And again, this was true especially for workers representing lower wage workers in cleaning, janitorial services, and food and accommodation services. Okay, so I'll wrap up here quickly. And as I mentioned before, unions representing public sector workers tended to prioritize different issues, things like pay, hours of work, and remote work, whereas unions representing private sector workers tend to focus on job security more. And as I said, most provisions were temporary in nature, but there were a sort of set of unions that tried to strategize, it seems, and embed these as permanent features, which we think is a promising development. And then I'll just mention that we're almost done drafting the first paper out of this, and we've started doing some field research with key informants with union staff who bargained during the pandemic, especially in the low-wage sector, so in grocery, for example. And so we're in the process of coding that now, and some interesting stuff there too. And as I mentioned at the start, this kind of narrative of a missed opportunity is really coming out in that a lot of unions that wish they had done more and looking back realized that they had a real opportunity to do things and didn't. So thank you very much.